Imagine a world where people ignore warning signs, live immersed in false promises, and resist all forms of change. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? But we're talking about over 2,000 years ago, during Jeremiah's time. He wasn't just a prophet. He was a young man chosen to deliver a message no one wanted to hear, a message of judgment and hope. And believe it or not, the challenges he faced aren't so different from the ones we face today. After all, who hasn't felt isolated for standing up for the truth in a world that prefers comfortable lies? Jeremiah teaches us something powerful. Faith isn't a shield against pain, but a bridge that sustains us through it. His story is a mirror for anyone who has ever faced rejection, doubt, or even moments of spiritual crisis. It's impossible to overlook the relevance of his messages about false prophets, the cost of disobedience, and the promise of renewal. But what if this isn't just an ancient tale? What if Jeremiah's journey is exactly what we need to navigate our own challenges and strengthen our faith today? Here's a thought to ponder. If Jeremiah was called to transform a generation amidst chaos, what does that say about you? His story still resonates because, like him, we all have a role to play. Maybe it's time to discover yours. Jeremiah never expected life to place such a grand calling upon him. He was young, without influence or power, when God chose him to be a prophet. Imagine being tasked with carrying divine messages to entire nations. He felt small, inadequate, and even tried to escape this responsibility. Isn't it strange how we often focus on what we lack in moments like these? But God doesn't choose arbitrarily. He saw in Jeremiah the potential the young man himself couldn't see. And that's where the transformation began. God promised him strength and protection, a powerful reminder that faith can overcome any limitation. But what is a calling without challenges? God revealed to Jeremiah that he would face resistance, opposition, and even danger. Can you imagine? Being the lone voice trying to warn an entire nation while everyone ignores or mocks you. Jeremiah hesitated, who wouldn't? He even said, "I am only a child." Such a human and relatable reaction. But here's the mystery. God not only chose him, but he also equipped him. And that was exactly what kept Jeremiah steadfast, even when his own faith was tested. Can you sense something greater unfolding here? And then comes the great revelation. God told Jeremiah something that changed everything. "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you." Think about that. Before he was even born, he had a purpose. Doesn't that make you question your own role in this world? Just as Jeremiah was called during times of crisis and impending destruction, like the fall of Jerusalem, maybe our daily struggles are part of a greater plan. Sometimes, the beginning is just the first act. The next chapters might surprise even us. Jeremiah didn't have good news to share. What God placed on his heart was heavy, an unavoidable judgment for the people of Judah. Corruption was everywhere, unjust leaders, rampant idolatry, and a complete departure from faith. Imagine carrying the weight of warning an entire nation that destruction was at the door. The prophet had powerful visions that symbolized what was to come. An almond branch, for instance, showed that God was watchful and would act swiftly. But of course, not everyone wanted to hear that. After all, who enjoys facing the truth when it exposes such deep flaws? What would you do in Jeremiah's position? The visions he received weren't just symbolic images. They were clear messages of divine action. A boiling pot tilted from the north signified danger approaching, with the Babylonian army as the instrument of God's judgment. Yet here's the crucial point. The people had time to change, but they refused. It's fascinating how human nature resists change, even when the consequences are evident. Jeremiah knew his message wouldn't be welcomed. Still, he persisted, believing that the gospel was non-negotiable. It was the absolute truth. As days passed, Jeremiah's warnings grew more urgent. He wasn't just a bearer of bad news, but someone who hoped the people could avoid the worst. But were they ready to abandon idolatry and injustice? Or were they so blinded that destruction was inevitable? This is where the tension rises. Jeremiah saw a tragic fate approaching, yet he also knew that God had a greater purpose in it all. The calamity wasn't the end. It was part of a plan to renew faith and restore what had been lost. Being a prophet was far from glamorous, and Jeremiah quickly realized this. Imagine being called to speak the truth, even knowing no one wants to hear it. From the very beginning, he faced rejection. His own people despised him, leaders ridiculed him, and some even conspired against him. You can feel the weight of that, can't you? Being alone in such a massive mission can shake even the strongest. Jeremiah had no support, only the assurance that God was with him. But was that assurance enough to keep his faith intact? His loneliness wasn't just emotional, it was physical too. Jeremiah was persecuted, imprisoned, and publicly humiliated. At one point, in utter despair, he cursed the day he was born. So great was his pain. This reminds us that even the most spiritual can feel lost when facing constant opposition. Yet, even in this valley of tears, Jeremiah remained faithful. He wept for the people, prayed for their salvation, and fulfilled his mission, even when everything seemed to conspire against him. His faith was like a lighthouse in the darkness, a light he never let go out. And here's where the story gets even deeper. Despite all the pain and rejection, Jeremiah never lost sight of the greater purpose. He knew his loneliness was the cost of obedience, but he also understood that he wasn't truly alone. God was there, guiding every step, sustaining him in his hardest moments. Can you imagine such inner strength? It's as if the pain itself brought him closer to God, shaping him for something greater. And perhaps, at this point, the loneliness didn't seem so unbearable. After all, the true climax was yet to come. Jeremiah wasn't alone in the spiritual arena, but the company he had often made his mission even harder. False prophets were everywhere, proclaiming messages that tickled the ears of the people. They said, "Everything is fine. Peace and prosperity are on the way." But these words were illusions, like beautiful facades, hiding homes ready to collapse. Jeremiah, on the other hand, was like a solitary voice in the wilderness, declaring what no one wanted to hear. Judgment was inevitable. And how was that received? With applause? Far from it. He was ridiculed, discredited, and treated as an enemy of the people. The tension only grew. While Jeremiah warned of Jerusalem's destruction, the false prophets worked against him, promoting the idea that the worst would never come. One of the most striking confrontations was with Hananiah, a prophet who confidently declared that Babylonian captivity would last only 2 years, a message of false hope. Jeremiah, however, knew the truth. He responded firmly, stating that only time would reveal who truly carried God's word. Imagine the weight of this spiritual battle, where truth was constantly being suffocated by lies that fueled false hope. And then the moment of revelation arrived. Hananiah didn't just challenge Jeremiah. He defied God's word itself. Jeremiah confronted him publicly, making it clear that his prophecy was a dangerous deception. Shortly after, Jeremiah's words came true, and Hananiah died, exposing the fragility of the lies he proclaimed. Here, the story becomes even more gripping. It wasn't just truth versus lies, but life versus death, genuine faith versus distortion. And at the same time, a lingering question remains. How can we discern truth amidst so many competing voices? After so many harsh messages and warnings of destruction, it seemed like all hope was lost. Jeremiah had warned of judgment, captivity, and the fall of Jerusalem. But then, amidst all the darkness, he brought a message no one expected, a promise of restoration. Imagine the shock of hearing that, even after all the suffering, God hadn't given up on his people. It was like a gentle breeze in the middle of a scorching desert. But this hope didn't come without conditions. Restoration would only be possible if they genuinely turned back to God. Jeremiah announced something extraordinary. God would make a new covenant, but this time it wouldn't be based on external rules like stone tablets or rituals. This new covenant would be written on the hearts of the people. Have you ever thought about what that means? No longer would they need intermediaries or constant sacrifices. God desired a direct, personal, and profound relationship with his people. It's like reconnecting emotionally after a long period of distance, something that touches the soul and changes everything. But of course, for this to happen, the people needed to acknowledge their mistakes and seek the truth. And then Jeremiah revealed a detail that brought even more hope. The promise of a righteous king, a descendant of David, who would govern with wisdom and restore justice. This prophecy pointed to something far greater than just the physical rebuilding of Jerusalem. It echoed in the hearts of the faithful, like a distant but comforting melody. Yet, at the same time, a question lingered. Were they ready to embrace this new opportunity? Or were they still trapped in the old patterns that led to their downfall? Jeremiah's warning finally became reality. The destruction of Jerusalem was like a cry of despair echoing across the nation. The Babylonians surrounded the city, and what was once Judah's pride, with its magnificent temple, now faced chaos. Imagine the terror of those days. The temple, a symbol of God's presence, consumed by flames, the walls, once so secure, reduced to rubble. It was more than just physical devastation. It was as if the nation's very soul was being torn apart. Jeremiah had warned them, but few believed. Now they stood face to face with the consequences of their disobedience. Amid the chaos, Jeremiah's prophecy was hard to ignore. He had spoken of exile, of how the people would be taken to a foreign land. And that's exactly what happened. Men, women, and children were torn from their homes and forced to march to Babylon. Think about the emotional weight of that. For many, it felt as though God had abandoned them, as though their faith had been lost along with the city. But here's the crucial point. Even in this tragedy, there was an underlying message, a greater purpose. The exile wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something new. Here lies the climax of this story. The judgment that seemed so harsh had a redemptive purpose. God hadn't abandoned them. He was refining them. The exile was a way to break cycles of idolatry and corruption that had overtaken the people. It was an opportunity for both spiritual and physical renewal. It's fascinating to think that, even amid the fall, God was planting seeds for future restoration. But the question remains, would the people recognize it, or would they remain blinded by pain and loss, unable to see what God still had in store for them? Amid so much pain and destruction, Jeremiah still carried a certainty that seemed almost absurd. God had not abandoned his people. Think about the weight of that. He saw the suffering, felt the devastation around him, yet he continued to proclaim that there was hope. How is it possible to hold on to faith in such difficult times? Jeremiah knew that the judgment on Judah was not the final chapter. It was like a storm that, though terrifying, had the power to clear the sky for a new beginning. But were the people ready to believe that? Jeremiah showed that faith is not just about belief but perseverance. Even when everyone around him was drowning in despair, he kept the flame of trust in God alive. This teaches us something profound. True faith isn't measured by good times, but by how we respond when everything seems to fall apart. Jeremiah prayed constantly, interceded for the people, and never stopped believing that God had a greater purpose. It's a practical lesson for all of us. In times of difficulty, instead of succumbing to bitterness, why not strengthen our trust in something greater? And then, Jeremiah revealed something that made it all the more intriguing. God wasn't just allowing the suffering. He was using it to transform. It was a hard lesson to accept, but the exile would become the catalyst for spiritual renewal. The promise of restoration remained alive, even when it seemed impossible to achieve. This is where Jeremiah challenges us. Can we see beyond the immediate chaos? He invites us to look past the pain and recognize the purpose that, even if we can't understand it now, will be revealed in due time. And deep down, the lingering question remains, how far are we willing to trust? Jeremiah showed us that true faith is one that endures rejection, overcomes suffering, and stays firm even when everything seems lost. But now comes the big question. What will you do with all of this? Are you willing to apply his teachings to your life? Maybe you're facing false judgments, uncertainties, or even doubting your purpose. If that's the case, what can you learn from Jeremiah's courage, who never gave up even when the world around him was falling apart? And what if the time to act is now? Perhaps it's time to reflect on your choices, dive deeper into the gospel, and strengthen your faith. Start small. Dedicate time to prayer. Read Jeremiah's messages in the Old Testament and ask yourself, what is God trying to show you? Don't ignore the signs, as Judah did. Instead, use adversities as opportunities for renewal, because transformation begins when you decide to take the first step. But here's a challenge. How far are you willing to trust in God's purpose for your life? Jeremiah knew that suffering wasn't the end, but part of a greater plan. Are you seeing beyond the chaos? If the answer isn't clear yet, keep seeking. And while you reflect on this, don't forget to share your thoughts. Write in the comments. What part of Jeremiah's story touched you the most? And of course, don't leave without subscribing to the channel and activating the notifications. Here, we continue exploring stories that transform lives and strengthen your journey. Let's move forward together on this path.